Hello. Welcome and thank you for checking out the first episode of Philosophy versus Work, the podcast that examines the ethics of the work ethic and other existential, phenomenological, mythological, ontological, and socio-political questions regarding work, life, and death. I am Michael Murray, and I'll be your guide on this philosophical journey. Episode 1, the introduction, or who the hell am I, and what are we doing here? So, you may be asking, who am I that you should take your most precious commodity, time, out of your day to listen to a complete stranger wax on and wax off philosophically? Given the nature of the show, let's start with the academic bona fides. I am not a professor and I don't have a PhD. I do, however, have an MA in ethics and applied philosophy. I picked up that degree from UNC Charlotte, which has a small but very practically oriented philosophy department whose faculty research focuses on big data, medical and bioethics, aesthetics, pragmatism, and, dare I say, feminism and critical theories of race, social justice, and economics. My MA research was what is now the jumping off point for this podcast, a query into the potential for meaningful work as an ethical and political project to combat the ethical and moral faults that thoroughly permeate our working lives in a late capitalist economy. Central to this project is an existentialist turning towards death that reframes work in terms of our mortality, aiming to short-circuit the idea that work has value, specifically moral value, in itself, separate from our lived experience, and that thus gives our lives meaning. Then questioning what kind of work is being done in this economy, by whom, how, why, and critically, who benefits. And finally, how does the work ethic, and more importantly, a work ethic culture, shape our attitudes towards work? I'll note quickly that to limit this question to workplace or political rhetoric is, I believe, short-sighted and distracting. At least in the U.S., both prevailing sides of the political debate have shown a deep and long-standing commitment to the Protestant and/or capitalist work ethic. And as far as workplace rhetoric, well, it should go without saying that your employer being interested in your work ethic is in their own self-interest, regardless of what it may do for you or society as a whole. Now, let's jump way back and set up how I got here. Thinking back to high school, as a graduating senior, we were given an assignment to write about a paragraph of where we saw ourselves in 10 years, slap this on some construction paper, and provide some illustration or art of some kind for the school to decorate the halls in advance of graduation day. I don't remember all of the details, but I know I drew a cartoon of myself as fit and skinny with long hair and a ponytail and a dignified Obi-Wan Kenobi beard, wearing circle-framed John Lennon glasses, a Metallica t-shirt, waistcoat, jeans, and Chuck Taylor high tops. I remember that one specifically. I had drawn that cartoon before. I presumed I'd be a professor of Eastern philosophy and fairly nomadic, like an 80s TV-styled philosophy mercenary traveling the world and solving problems, like TNG meets Quantum Leap meets the A-Team, but without the guns. Suffice to say, that didn't happen. To be fair, I hadn't really set myself up for that to ever succeed. I also had not yet discovered Doctor Who, so didn't know that plotline really existed. I wanted to be a comic book artist, a writer, a Navy fighter pilot, Batman. No, I really thought Batman was a realistically attainable career at that time. A stretch goal, sure, but still realistic. But I never committed to any of those paths. Within those 10 years after high school, I had, with one set of paperwork left to go, changed my mind about joining the Navy, failed out of a community college business admin program and a restaurant management program, worked every position at Chuck E. Cheese. Yes, including the costumes. Sold men's clothing, failed at a few relationships, and eventually gone back to Chuck E. as a manager. Oh, and my hairline had receded. Not enough to be, quote, bald, but beyond the point that ponytail was ever going to be possible. Granted, along the way, I made some lifelong friends that are still dear to me now and I'm still close with, even 20 years after that. But the philosophy nomad warrior had become an idea of the past. Until I went back to school as an adult. This time, though, I wasn't going to waste my time on a pointless degree like business administration. Now, to me, it really was pointless. I absolutely hated it. I thought high school was less boring, and after elementary school catechism, our church called it religious education, was less dogmatic. Not to mention, it was never what I wanted to do. The idea was do the thing, get the degree, then earn enough money to actually go to school, and finally get my philosophy degree that way. My parents hadn't gone to college, so my whole idea of college was shaped by uninspiring guidance counselors and movies like Revenge of the Nerds, Animal House, and PCU. If you're not familiar with this semi-obscure 90s gem, go check it out. The thought of majoring in art or philosophy, or any of the classical liberal arts for that matter, was something only rich kids could afford to do, or so I thought. So I needed to get rich first. Since we didn't come from money, which isn't to say that we suffered or anything. Far from it. My parents actually lived, as we discovered later, well beyond their means so that we could have a, quote, normal middle-class childhood. But I don't want to turn this whole episode into a memoir. Point is, my career plan, if you could even call it that, sucked. So, given the opportunity to go back to school thanks to the generosity of a family friend, I enrolled in an Associate of Fine Arts program at CPCC, intending to pair that with certificates in 2D illustration and game design, as I saw it basically a vocational art degree that could get me in the door somewhere like Blizzard as a concept artist. Now, this was December 2007. World of Warcraft was still huge, the Iraq War was a royal clusterfuck, the economy was just going into the Great Recession. I was still, by registration anyway, a Republican, though deeply dissatisfied with the party, and some friends were telling me to check out this young senator from Illinois named Obama. I was working as a service bartender. I made drinks and desserts at an upscale casual spot where all my interaction was with the servers and kitchen staff. Smoking was, for a little longer, still permitted in bars and restaurants here in Charlotte. Where I worked was smoke-free, indoors anyway. The owners wanted the only smoke smell to be from the hickory wood grill, and tobacco smoke is hell on the inside of a wine glass hanging upside down at the bar. Note, if you're at a bar and people can smoke indoors and you see upside-down glassware, do not get a glass of wine. Also, if this is your experience of wine and you don't like wine, that might be why you don't like wine. Moving on. The Transformers of my youth had become Base-plosions. Dolores Umbridge had proven that lawful good characters can indeed be villains. And, the birth of the MCU was just on the horizon. February 2008, 1 month into my new life as an actual art student, my mom passed suddenly. Cue events that redirected my academic and intellectual life henceforth. Death has a way of doing that. My grandmother passed 2 years later, and my father another year after that. It has long been one of my great regrets just how long I put off college, chasing what I perceived I was qualified to do to earn a paycheck, and that academic successes came so late. As I said, my parents never went to college. I'm the first and so far the only one in my immediate family to do so. I eventually earned the AFA, but I dropped the certificates. I decided to finish a full 4-year program and enrolled at UNCC, initially as a political science major. The declaration requirements for an art and art history major, in 2010 anyway, for a transfer student were a bit wonky due to the art major portfolio requirement, so I picked my second choice, originally intended to be a second major, political science. Like my dad, I'm a politics and history junkie. I was also at the time binging The West Wing and entertaining thoughts of going to law school, getting into Democratic politics, talk about a 180, and becoming a real Josh Lyman. I soon enough changed majors to art history, eventually graduated from UNCC summa cum laude with departmental honors in art history, with minors in political science and philosophy. I was trying to pursue a PhD in Japanese contemporary art, but needed more language credit and got derailed. The professor I was going to work with took a position as a dean and couldn't take on new students for 2 years. So I re-enrolled at UNCC for a graduate certificate in ethics while taking free Japanese classes. Life happened. I missed a round of PhD applications. I wasn't getting any younger. And in 2016 decided to go back to UNCC one more time and finish a master's program, adding to the credits from my grad certificate to get an MA in ethics and applied philosophy. When I finished my AFA, I didn't walk in the ceremony or even request a formal diploma, just the official transcript. I considered not walking for my BA. My parents wouldn't be there, but ultimately decided to do it for myself, to give thanks to my professors, and to get my sisters to maybe bring their kids so they could see a college campus and maybe be inspired to go that route. Side note, that part didn't happen. I suppose it still could. If I went as an adult, why can't they? Hint, hint. As for my MA, I graduated in December and I was the sole representative for my program walking among a lot of engineering and data science grads. Well, that was December 2018. At this point, I was still considering PhD studies, in philosophy now though, but my GRE scores were expired, my student loans from undergrad had been manageable, but became pretty bloated by the time the MA was done. I wanted to put some money in the bank, needed to retake the GREs. I was able to stop the employed bartending after getting hired on as a paid undergrad art history TA, though I kept up the occasional bartend for caterer friends as a side hustle. And I had a part-time IT asset management Permalancer office gig. For those of you not familiar with the term Permalancer, I was a contracted third party, What would traditionally have been a temp, except I'd held the position for 5 years at this point, with 2 different temp agencies no less after the company cut ties with the first one. I received a regular paycheck with taxes withdrawn, was not considered 1099 independent to the government, but as far as the client company was concerned, I was an independent contractor and owed no benefits. I knew there was prior interest in hiring me on, so I started talking with my supervisor about doing so, figuring a several-month-long trip to Japan was completely off the table at this point, and I would be in Charlotte for at least the next year and a half. Well, that did not go to plan either. Long story short, my supervisor took a lateral promotion to a different department. My team got shuffled from finance back to IT support. We got buried in work over the next year due to a mandatory company-wide OS conversion and device refresh. And there was something else. COVID. I did eventually get brought on as a real employee and made okay money, markedly below industry average for the position, but the benefits were generous and I had my own health scare going into the pandemic. Spoiler, no longer an issue, but I advise against eating, drinking, and working too much, not exercising at all, and being generally sedentary. Surprisingly, that lifestyle is not actually conducive to living. So, I accepted the trade-off of wages for benefits. Now, granted, the wages were a good jump up from contracting, and if you're seeing the foreshadowing, congratulations, you're faster on the uptake than I was, and I literally wrote a thesis arguing against what I was doing. Now, here we are. I'm no longer with that company. In fact, I'm in about as precarious a position as ever, though perhaps, predictably, as least stressed as ever. I'm currently, quote, between jobs, though that's completely dependent on whatever happens next. I'm writing. I've started my own freelance voiceover business, which is still in its infancy, though I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, and I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm working on this podcast. So, what are my credentials? Work history? Check. Academic history? Check. Personal experiences of death and loss? More than I care to think about, though likely less than are to come. You have to figure every relationship is ultimately going to end either one of 2 ways. Either they go or you do. But this is too big a thought for right now, so we'll save that for another time. Or maybe you just wanted the "which Hogwarts house are you" version of my profile. Well, I'm a Xennial, with an X. I'm told I saw the first Star Wars in a drive-in theater. I was an infant. I was raised on 80s and 90s cartoons, Nintendo, doing my homework on paper when I did do my homework, and the general duck and cover law of safety that, lining up in the hall of my elementary school with my head against the wall and curled up in this vertical fetal position kind of thing, would protect me if Reagan and the commies ever lost their shit and started the apocalypse of flinging thermonuclear missiles at each other. My first job was almost at a comic book store. I was running errands and doing odd chores for the owners in exchange for swag and video game rental, but we moved before I turned 15 and they could legally hire me and pay me in actual money. R.E.M.'s Out of Time and Aerosmith's Pump are simultaneously the most impactful album of my youth. I picked up R.E.M., decided I didn't actually like anything else on the album after losing my religion, and returned it. I.e., I broke it in half and claimed it came that way, exchanging it instead for Pump, which launched me down the road to hard rock, metal, blues, Beethoven, and an oft-skeptical opinion about the value of the rules-as-written approach to rules. I've gone through about every style of sneaker, hiking, or goth-style boot, but ultimately still prefer Chuck Taylors. The flannel over t-shirt with jeans is my go-to aesthetic of choice for comfort. I wear far less black these days, but far more gray. After almost 40 years of 2010 vision, I do now wear glasses to read, like both my parents. I have seen every Godzilla and Star Trek movie, multiple times, including the bad ones. I've read the entirety of The Wheel of Time. Matt is my favorite character, though Perrin is a close second. I have a cat, Kyo. She is my shadow, my familiar, and my baby. I love D&D, and I enjoy either being a player or a DM. DragonCon is my happy place. If you don't know what DragonCon is, hit pause and look it up now. It's okay. I'll wait. I have 4 Starfleet uniforms. If you include the cocktail lounge attire, they are all blue. New Year's is my favorite holiday. I prefer small, fun Japanese cars, though I'm not mechanically inclined enough to have ever bothered modding them. I play bass guitar, or dabble in it, really. I have been in a band, even played a gig once at a real bar. Okay, it was a convenience store / bar, but they had a big patio with a stage, so same thing, right? Oh, and I'd like to think I'm Gryffindor, but if I'm being honest with myself, I'm Ravenclaw. Still here? Great. Now that you have an idea of who I am, let's get into where this podcast is going. As I mentioned earlier, the target of this project is confrontation with the ethical and moral faults in the landscape of our current working lives. especially those disguised, concealed, or even inverted as values by the concept of work ethic, and the political projects by the right and left committed to employment as a solution, and what I am broadly, for now, calling work culture. This includes, but is not limited to, how we are socialized to work. How work is made a social, moral, and political imperative, the social organization of work and its economic overlays, capitalism, socialism, communism, etc. How capitalism has transformed from an economic overlay to a social substrate, to borrow a term from Deleuze and Guattari, a socius, upon which our social lives are now organized, rather than how we organize resources. It may be fair to consider this component a sociocultural anthropology of work. This confrontation takes two forms. The first is a philosophical critical analysis of the issue at hand, whether that's work under the conditions of capitalism, socialism, etc., broadly speaking, or more narrowly focused, such as work requirements for social benefits, entitlements, artisanal work versus mass market manufacturing, shit jobs versus bullshit jobs, nod to David Graeber, on-demand scheduling, surge pricing of goods, without, it's important to note, Wendy's, dodged a bullet, a correlative surge adjustment to wages, imposed systemic poverty, culture war politics, challenges to work such as global capitalism. No, China is not a communist economy, it is state-managed capitalism. And the transference of labor to impoverished and/or developing populations, as we in the developed world seek to simultaneously unburden ourselves of these menial jobs while demanding cheaper products and higher profit margins. In doing so, are we creating an Amalas problem, not just allowing the suffering of some for the benefit of others, but baking it into the global economic model? Is this kind of economic development any different from earlier colonizing modes or saving the savages? Resource exploitation, climate change, bloodied commodities. What does it mean, as a worker and a consumer, to take seriously the imperative to do no harm? What about automation? An old question, but perennially relevant. And do we need a new Marxism to address the information economy, or as Mackenzie Wark put it, the vectoralist class? And AI. What happens to the, quote, value of work when even the creative and intellectual jobs are automated away? What of the possibility of overcoming traditional work entirely through AI and robotic automation? Can we achieve an economy based on care, creation, and collaboration, rather than greed for profit and individual ownership? Do we still need money? Do we need UBI, universal basic income? Do we need it now or later? Is money just a control mechanism? And so on. The second form is existentialist, and specifically, in borrowing from Heidegger, and I know he's problematic and we'll get to that when we get to him, in turning towards death. This, I believe, is how this project can be taken from theoretical philosophy and economics to ethics and an actionable political project. In all considerations of work, and in life in general for that matter, we need to take our own mortality, the finality of death, and the lack of any form of afterlife, or for the faithful, at least the possibility of the lack of an afterlife. As believers are often quick to point out to atheists, what if you're wrong? And the lack of any external force, such as a god or other divine or alien arbiter, as giver of meaning to life. And critically, the anxiety, the angst, felt in facing mortality head-on as a first principle. This part cannot be understated. To confront the ethicality of the work ethic, we need more than to know its origin and utility, its weaponization, and how it developed and how it continues to be wielded by, for, and against us. We need a way to get to an alternative, a genealogy of the work ethic, and the development of a new, better, affirmative, and empowering value of work. The subject of modern, consumerist, informational capitalist society is bombarded at every waking moment by demands on one's time and attention. Financial demands, rents, mortgages, utilities, healthcare, education, debts, sensationalism and fear-mongering in the media, again on right and left, though the fears exploited generally being different. The left typically driving toward unity in opposition to anxiety to power, in contrast to the right driving division through development of in-groups and fear of the other or that which is not like us. And distraction, the old circuses part of bread and circuses. Sports, movies, concerts, anything and everything spectacle. And, of course, marketing. If you're not keeping up on the current tech, the current trends, clothing fashions, etc., well, then what are you doing with your money? And if you don't have the disposable income, then there's always credit. And if you have neither money nor credit, well, then there must be something wrong with you. And finally, social media. The promise of democratization of information and easy maintenance of personal relationships, commodified, advertised, and mined for profit. A Pandora's box of possibility and toxicity. Now, these are just some of the questions and themes that we'll be addressing in this podcast. We'll also be looking into the philosophy as genre aspects, unpacking the texts and the thinkers that have informed this discussion of the ethics of work. Contemporary thinkers such as David Graeber, Mark Fisher, James Livingston, as well as the canon, authors such as Locke, Mill, Marx, and Weber, will be digging into questions of life and living, art and technology, suffering and joy. So Deleuze, Foucault, Benjamin, Heidegger, de Beauvoir, Marcuse, Camus, Fanon, Bataille, Roland Barthes, well, it's a long list, and I imagine it will only get longer. If you know these names, then you probably have an idea of where I'm coming from philosophically, and probably where I'm trying to go. If you don't, well, I hope you'll stick around and come to think of this as a gateway to approach these texts yourselves and pursue your own investigation into these questions, issues, and these authors. Finally, a word of warning. This isn't a neutral discussion. Obviously, I have an agenda, which I'd like to think I've made pretty clear. I believe capitalism and the work ethic are not just economic problems, but ethical problems. When asking the question, what does it mean that, what are the impacts of, accepting work, choosing to fill my time in the service of something and or someone else, I mean to put that question forward in the face of inevitable but unforeseeable death. The future is not guaranteed. In a state of constant contingency, working towards something holds no guarantee it will ever be achieved, no matter how reasonable the goal. Now, I don't intend for this to be a doom and gloom podcast. In fact, quite the opposite. My aim in thinking about death is to draw focus to the sublime, the beautiful, and joyous that lies at the heart of one of the oldest philosophical questions. What is the good life? Taking that a step further, how can we employ ethics socially, politically, to make life good for all? Understandably, there will be some, many even, for whom this project is too dark, too morbid, too sad, too haunted, or perhaps even triggering, and while I hope you'll give it a chance, I understand if you can. Though, if this is your stopping point, I encourage you to check out Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tiwary's Future Tense, Why Anxiety is Good for You, Even Though It Feels Bad. As for those for whom this podcast is too heretical, too atheist, too liberal, too leftist, etc., well, first, if you've made it this far, I hope you'll consider hanging around. You may never agree with me in full, but maybe you'll discover something that pushes you to question your own values and see if they hold up to scrutiny. Dogmatism is a dangerous thing. Beliefs can change. Mine certainly did. And they should change if they can't withstand scrutiny. Being observant, analytical, creative, but more importantly, being curious, that has never done me a disservice. I struggled for a while to come up with a title for the show, though I suspect that's a common thread among podcasters. The original thesis title, Towards Meaningful Work, Labor Time and the Turn Towards Death, it's too long and too narrowly focused for what I'd like to do here. Work, death, and ethics felt like a decent pun on the old certainties of life joke, and there were a bunch of others that just aren't even worth mentioning. I finally settled on philosophy versus work as it was quick, open-ended, and had something of a call to action to it, and to be honest, it has a little of a Godzilla versus Kong feel to it. I mean, even if work loses, work wins, because someone needs to do the work of philosophy for philosophy to win. I'm a strong proponent of the idea of philosophy as a toolbox and a method, that, like art, good philosophy does something. The point, after all, is to change the world. Anyone? Anyone? All right, so next week we really start. I'll be discussing, if you'll forgive the self-indulgence, my previously mentioned MA project. Now, don't worry, I'm not just going to sit here and read the whole thing to you, but I am going to lean on it for the next few episodes to preface the work to come, to provide a conceptual framework and vocabulary for this first chapter of episodes, the authors, the questions, and what I thought in 2018 was a potential solution to the problem of work as an ethical project. See you then. Actually, that makes no sense. I'm not going to see any of you. If you enjoyed this episode of Philosophy versus Work, well, you know the shtick. Please like, subscribe, follow, leave a review. It really does help to grow the show. You can stare all you want into the algorithm, but it doesn't stare back without likes and subscribes. Don't forget to check out the show notes for details on any authors, texts, etc. referenced directly in this episode. Thank you.